It's my pleasure now to introduce the moderator for the next session. Dr. John Beholovic is a professor of history at the University of South Florida, Tampa. He earned his master's and doctor's degree from the University of Nebraska and his bachelor's from Thiel College in Greenville, Pennsylvania. A widely published author of 19th century historical research, he serves as chairman of the Florida Humanities Council, chair of the City of Tampa Ethics Commission, and is a member of the University Press of Florida editorial board. Dr. Beholovic.
Thank you, David. It is truly a pleasure to be here this afternoon, and I particularly am delighted to see the universities represented along with the state colleges, and we appreciate your hospitality in that regard and for your sponsorship. Let me assure you that the problems that we're talking about this afternoon in terms of performance, student performance, evaluation, and measurement are shared by our institutions as well as your institutions. Indeed. It will come as no surprise to any of you in this room that the hot button issue in academia today is performance measurement. All across the country, colleges and universities are being given standards by which performance is graded, rewarded, and sadly punished. Depending upon performance outcomes, our very existence seems to be at stake, at least financially, doesn't it? Florida is certainly no exception. The state colleges this past spring were given a comprehensive set of performance standards by the Florida DOE, and administrators have been scrambling ever since to mine their data and adjust their strategies to focus on those standards. Standards focus on student success. Success in completing courses, obtaining a certificate or degree, and finding a well-paying job in their career field. As academics who emphasize civic engagement, we know that this kind of activity contributes to student success. We witness it in our own students, and the limited data bears it out. But how can the colleges maximize civic engagement? How can we do that to boost performance evaluations? That is the question that you are no doubt curious about, and why you are gathered here this afternoon, and what this panel is about to explore. Without further comment then, let me introduce our distinguished panel of educators. Each will make brief remarks before our discussion begins, and yes, don't worry, we will have time for questions and answers. Dr. Brian Sponsler, at the end, has been engaged in higher education policy research at the federal and state levels for over a decade. He currently serves as the director of the Post-Secondary and Workforce Development Institute at the Education Commission of the states. And Brian mentioned to me a few minutes ago what I did not know, that he and another of our panelists, Archie, were in fact in the same cohort, doctoral cohort at George Washington University. Dee Dee Rasmussen is celebrating her 14th, celebrating, I guess is fair, Dee Dee? Celebrating.
Absolutely.
Yeah, her 14th year as the executive director of the Campus Compact. She's an FSU grad, I guess, and proud of it, right, with an MPA. She, prior to her Campus Compact service, she was a senior staff member in state government, and also I'm sure would be upset if I didn't mention that she was the vice chair of the Leon County School Board. Dr. Anthony Covarrubias is the vice provost for institutional effectiveness at Miami-Dade, where he provides leadership for the college's research, planning, assessment, and evaluation activities. Prior to serving at Miami-Dade, Dr. Covarrubias worked in the U.S. Department of Education for a decade during the Bush and Obama administrations. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Susan Demers, who many of you I'm sure in this room know, is the Dean of the College of Policy, Ethics, and Legal Studies right here at St. Petersburg College. So without further ado, Dr. Sponsler.
Great, thank you, John. I think I can
Oh, look at that. So thank you very much for the introduction and the opportunity to be a part of the panel, to have a conversation today a little bit about the intersection of outcomes-based funding models or performance-based funding models and the metrics that are being employed within those models and what that means for those of you in the room that are working on civic engagement initiatives with your students and colleagues on campus. Before I start the formal remarks, I was talking to Lynn before, and I have to point out that the prior panel was very exciting and interesting to me and felt like I was at my dinner table with my father. He spent 30 plus years as a city attorney and county council in local government. I grew up at city council meetings and had hopes and dreams of being a city manager myself. And I had not heard someone rant about special districts like that since my dad used to do that at meetings. So this is a wonderful opportunity. I was a public administration undergraduate student myself at a small liberal arts college in the Pacific Northwest. And civic engagement activities and efforts, in addition to public policy, is really a family business for me. My wife is a faculty member at Denver University whose research interests and professional practice have been about engaging students in civic engagement activities. And so I appreciate the opportunity and honor to be here and talk about two things that matter a lot to me. My role on this panel is really to just frame out quickly at a 30,000 foot level sort of the landscape of performance-based funding or outcomes-based funding policy at the state level, and to talk a little bit about what national trends have been, what we've seen in terms of the type of metrics that states are putting into their outcomes-based funding models, and then suggest a couple of interaction points I think that exist for the civic engagement and civic-minded efforts of our college campuses as we think about how to support institutional performance by these evaluations. So that's a little bit about where we're going to go. Some of this stuff will be like drinking from a fire hydrant, but we're going to do that real quick. We can come back to any of these things in a question and answer conversation. So to start us off, I think I want to suggest and share a little bit about one way in which we can think about the complexity that exists in state outcomes-based funding models through using a tool, using a typology that we can create to categorize the different ways in which states are approaching this particular policy question. I think it's useful in two ways to think about performance-based funding state actions through this lens or this typology, because it allows us to have some consistent language that can be benchmarked to compare states against one another about where they stand with their policy postures. And then as Florida is exemplified over the past several years, this is a changing and pretty fluid policy conversation about what states are doing with outcomes-based funding. This isn't a brand new conversation. This is a policy area that's evolved over the better part of 3 or 4 decades. But the typology allows us to have states be able to move up and down sort of this evaluation metric we can put across the policies. And I say that because what I'm going to do then is the opposite and highly simplify a map and a conversation, but I want to suggest that context that's important. And so one way that we think about the different sort of levels, and I can highlight a couple of these things. I know the font is small there. But when we create sort of 4 classes of what we consider policy action that states have undertaken in outcomes-based and performance funding, they really range from type 1 to type 4 on a couple of key indicators. One is the funding piece. Right, so one of the things John mentioned is the perception, I think, that there's sort of some 100% of state dollars that come to institutions are going to be allocated through these formulas. And that, in fact, is not the case in the majority of states, right? So we see great variability in how much money is actually being allocated to institutions through outcomes-based formulas. So that's one key critical difference when we look across states. Another are things like tying those performance-based funding metrics to a clearly articulated state college completion or attainment goal, for example. How aggressively do the performance-based funding policies speak to the needs to include historically underrepresented student populations in some of the outcomes data that we look at? So first-generation college students, minority students, and other populations that are important to a given state. So this is the way we can look across this, and again, I'm happy to provide more detailed information for anybody afterwards about where a particular state of interest may sit for you. But we know that when we look across all 4 of those sort of policy types, we see a tremendous amount of activity. So in fiscal year 2015, nearly 2/3 or slightly more than 2/3 of the states were either in a developmental phase for an outcomes-based funding policy or were implementing a policy that had previously been passed. Oregon, where I'm from, had the distinction of doing both in the same year because us Oregonians like to take on a lot of stuff all at once. We lost a governor in the middle of that, so that was an exciting thing for the state as well. But there's a lot of variation. So when we look at a map, the key takeaway here, the green are states that are currently implementing an outcomes-based funding model that affects some portion of their public sector. So some of these involve all institutions in the public 2-year and 4-year sector. Some are focused still only on the 4-year sector. The blue are states that were developing a model in fiscal year 2015. And so myself and staff and colleagues at other organizations that are working on this issue are in the process of updating this to reflect the changes that took place in the last legislative calendar. But this is where we see in the diffusion and widespread of this idea is one I think that suggests in some form it's here to stay in most places, right? And so I think we have to think about what that means. And one way to help us think about what that means specific to civic engagement activities on campus is to think across these different policies about what are the ways in which state-level leaders and decision makers are articulating a set of criteria by which they want to evaluate our public post-secondary institutions and primarily the outcomes of people that perform in those institutions. So we reviewed all 35 statutes plus and created sort of 5 buckets of themes that we're seeing. So one is student progression, right? Lots of metrics of evaluation in there about persistence, about transfer rates. Underserved students, again, a lot of the outcomes-based funding policies have taken an opportunity to say, we have pockets of students that currently exist within our institutions and pockets of citizens within our state who historically have not been served well by public institutions. And so we want to highlight the importance of that through this particular policy conversation. So we see things about first-generation students and measurements around access. Right, completion, the topic of the day, the big, I think, driver of some of the outcomes-based funding conversations in general. So we're measuring program completions, we're measuring degree completions, on-time degree completions, another way to think about it. And many states are, in fact, doing course completions that can happen within a quarter or semester as well. Efficiency and productivity. So a lot of language borrowed from the business community is now finding its way into our public policy making as it pertains to higher education. I think that's just a fact. There's not a value statement behind that. And one of those is the ROI terminology that we hear turned around a lot about how much are states getting for the investment that they're making in our institutions and the human capital that supports those institutions. So not surprisingly, this is finding its way into outcomes-based funding conversations as well. So we look at measures about total cost of per credit hour earned or number of degrees that are awarded by 100,000 of revenue that is being supplied by the state to the institution, right? These are some of those productivity and efficiency measures. And then the other buzzwords of the day is sort of workforce development, right? What are we doing to ensure that students that are coming into and through our institutions are finding their way to successful outcomes, and we're starting to think about ways that we might want to hold institutions accountable for some of those early career performance metrics around job placement and employment and graduate median salaries, right? So these are the 5 areas that across all 35 states, we see combinations and different levels of intensity about the types of individual metrics that states are putting into their performance-based funding policy schemes and holding institutions accountable. Right? So what does this mean if we feel like some of the civic engagement metrics and some of the activities that we know are so important to student experience on campus aren't reflected directly in the language we see coming out of outcomes-based funding policy conversations? I think there's sort of 2 ways, and I hope to set up a conversation we can have on the panel about this in more detail, sort of 2 ways in which I think the outcomes-based funding policy conversation allows for some injection of consideration about these civic engagement efforts. One is directly, right? So Florida is one of 5 states that currently allows some variability in the metrics that individual institutions are evaluated on, right? So it's not that all of these evaluative metrics are codified in statute, but in fact there's some operational choices to be made at institution and board levels about what type of metrics institutions can be evaluated on. At least conceptually, this provides an opportunity for those of us in the room to think about how do we make a case that those optional metrics where that opportunity exists capture things that might be more in line with the outcomes that we all know and articulate about what the impact of civic engagement efforts on campus are on our students and our communities, right? So there's sort of this direct way, and Florida happens to be in one place where we could talk about that a little bit, although it pertains more to the four-year public institutions here. The other way is more common and is something that I think for the Florida college system we're going to talk about. But sort of how do you make the secondary effects case, right? How do you say that we know that the engagement activities that we undertake on campus contribute to persistence rates, right? Contribute to graduation rates, that the skills that students are learning are actually the skills that get rewarded in the workforce, in the job market when our students go out and graduate. And so this case making, I think, is the most common and potentially, I think, has the opportunity to be a pretty effective way to talk about civic engagement efforts and initiatives within the confines of an outcomes-based funding model. So just 3 quick examples, and I'll pass it off to Dee Dee. So for the Florida University system, I share this just an example, metrics 9 and 10. This is the variability that I was talking about, right? So the Board of Governors has an opportunity to select an additional metric by which institutions will be evaluated. Board of Trustees at the institution level also has the opportunity to do that for the universities that are governed here in Florida under that system. In Indiana, we see this institutionally selected measure as part of the policy that covers 2-year institutions as well as 4-year institutions, right? So there's some nuance to the type of things that they can select from, but it's not a predefined list, and there's opportunities, again, for case making about how do institutions want to be evaluated within the structures of a performance-based funding policy scheme. And then just as a transition point for Dee Dee, these are the metrics for the Florida college system that John had mentioned at the top. And so the question is, how do we tie the energy and activity that's happening in our campus around civic engagement and civic-focused work to some of these metrics? How do we begin to make the case that there's a role for the work that we're doing to play in these outcomes-based funding policy models? So 4 takeaways in the afternoon, and then I'll pass it off to Dee Dee, right? So one is just know there's a lot of variation here, and I think there's a lot of mythology and fear around this particular strand of financing of higher education policy conversation. And so I think it's important for people to consider the context that they're in, learn as much as they can about the policies that are affecting the institution that you work in. Right, the second is that these outcomes-based funding metrics aren't picked at random, right? So they are things that reflect, at least for the decision makers in the room crafting the policy, what they believe the state goals and priorities and values of higher education are. So we have to meet, I think, those decision makers where they are and convince them to make some adjustments if that's what we're thinking about. I think conceptually, at least, there's opportunities for direct injection of these metrics into the formalized performance-based funding schemes that come out of public policies. And then certainly in all states, and I think in all cases, that this indirect case making about what we do at the institution level, having an impact in helping our institutions meet these performance metrics is really important. So appreciate the opportunity to kick that off. And of course, we can talk more later, and I will pass this off to Dee Dee.
We will. Brian, thank you very much. Dee Dee is going to establish some definitions criteria, I think, for measurement.
Good afternoon, and it's my pleasure to be here. I'm going to take a page out of Lynn's playbook and let you have some aerobic activity because I think you're falling down out there. It's 3:30. Please, why did I agree to this? Okay, so now, not just raise your hand. You have to wave at me, okay? How many of you know what Florida Campus Compact is? Yay! All right, you just made my day. Okay, good. How about how many of you know what service learning is? Oh my gosh, awesome. Okay, how many of you care about these performance metrics?
Yes.
Okay, how many of you are in a position at your institution that these performance metrics keep you up at night? Yeah, okay. So what I'd like to do is kind of offer you the opportunity, if I could be so bold as to suggest that I believe that our work in civic engagement and civic education can be that the work that we do, that service learning, for example, or engaged scholarship or community-based learning and those kinds of things, can result in more civically educated citizens, better prepared workforce-related graduates, and meet these performance measures all at the same time. So how can I say that? Well, because I'm a politician and that's what we do. So people ask me all the time, well, why did you leave, why'd you leave politics, go into education? So I'm going to tell you a story because I need you to wake up for me. So this politician and this preacher, they died on the same day, and they got to heaven, and Peter was at the gate, and they said, Peter said, well, come on in, I'm going to take you to where you're going to live. And so he says, okay. So they take the politician to his house first, and it's this beautiful, humongous mansion. It's absolutely extraordinary. And so the preacher, of course, is sitting there thinking, wow, I can't wait to see where I'm going to get to live. So they go a couple streets over, and they get to the preacher's house, and he goes, well, here you go, preacher, this is going to be your house. And the preacher's like, what? I guess it was just like a basic heaven house, I don't know. But he goes, you got this mixed up. He says, I have given my life to the Lord, I've spread the gospel, taken care of the poor and the needy, and that guy's a politician. He says, well, preacher, you have to understand. He says, we get preachers up here every day. This is the first politician we've ever had. Yay, you're listening. Okay, thank you. So why do we care about this work? I know I'm preaching to the choir again because I know you all have already had the Kool-Aid on your way in, but Dewey, I love this quote. Dewey says, the democracy has to be reborn in every generation, and education is its midwife, right? So we have to do this work. It's that important. So how do we marry the work that we do to get to these performance measures? I'm just going to, in case anybody here doesn't know what service learning is, let me just throw out a quick example, because one of the things we're trying to do at Campus Compact is to help faculty members find civic learning outcomes in every academic discipline. It can be done. This example would be just to take Lynn's thing about the water management districts, okay? Let's say you're teaching a biology class, and you're teaching your students about biology primarily, that's your job, right? You want the students to help the water management district get rid of some invasive species, let's just say. So they're doing their biology work there. But how many different civic learning outcomes could come out of an example like that, right? The water management district, first of all. The Department of Environmental Protection. What is the government policy around invasive species? Why would tax dollars be spent on these kinds of things? So all kinds of civic learning outcomes that could come out of a service learning experience that, in our case, the state of Florida, people probably don't know, and I think, Lynn, we need to talk about how we can help train our faculty on these outcomes. But, for example, the governor and cabinet sit collectively as the trustees of the Internal Improvement Trust Fund. That means that they hold title to all state lands. They buy the lands. The legislature appropriates the funds. They purchase these properties. Those are the kinds of things that students need to understand, that when the analogy I like is when I flip on the light switch, I just need to know the lights come on. I don't really need to know how the current got here. But when it comes to our government, we do need to know. We need to understand how it works and how our government, we are the government, we the people. So why, okay, which button do I push? This one. Yeah. There we go. All right, so actually Brian already had these up there. But what do you think about, we know that our work, when it's done well, results in job placement. We have better prepared students, better prepared citizens. The more engaged they are, the more likely they are to complete and graduate. That increases retention rates and certainly better prepares the workforce. So how do we know this? I don't know if you can see this. This was a study that actually was published by AAC&U. It was employers were surveyed in the year 2013, asked these are what hiring managers say they need more in their college graduates and to be better prepared for the workforce. And for almost every element that they listed, we can say that we know, our research shows that service learning or community engaged learning, when it's done well in a high quality reciprocal relationship, results in these things: critical thinking, scientific and quantitative reasoning, oral and written communication, development of an identity of a civic professional, intercultural competence, ethical values, responsibility, creative thinking, reflection, leadership, etc. So we believe what we do know about what we already do when it's done well results in these things. That's why when they said to me, you got to change your mission away from this civic engagement stuff, nobody cares about that anymore, all they care about is jobs, I said, that's not a problem. We prepare people for jobs. We prepare people to be employable and also civically minded. I can do both. We can do both. You can do both. The next slide is, we had a pilot program a couple of years ago called Connect to Complete. It was conducted in 3 states and evaluated by Brandeis University. Florida was one of them. In our pilot study, it was determined that the control group, the students who participated, these were low-income, at-risk community college students that were involved in a service learning component with peer mentors. The retention rate went up 6%. When I first heard this, I thought, 6%, that's not very much. And then somebody said, we spend millions to move the needle 1 degree. So 6%. I will show you this again at the end, but we have a manual. This is a plug-and-play program if you're interested. It's also about college access. We added a piece to the Florida program where college students go and talk to students who don't think they can go to college about coming to college. It's called College Positive Volunteers. And then once they get there, they've got this mentoring program to help them succeed, and specifically at a community college or a state college. The Carnegie Classification, how many of you are familiar with this? Okay, so this is now is the time to pay attention to this if you think you might be interested in having a more comprehensive, robust culture of engagement. The Carnegie Classification on Community Engagement, in Florida, the Board of Governors has included in their strategic plan that they want all of our state universities to attain this classification by the year 2025. The state colleges, I think Miami-Dade currently is the only state college that has this classification. 14 out of about 70 institutions in Florida have this classification. It won't be up again, now don't close your eyes on me here. It won't be available again until the year 2020, but preparation begins today in order to be in a posture of applying in 2018. The application information will come out in 2018. Campus Compact will have webinars. We can help you get ready to go, but this is going to, in order to attain this classification, even if you don't really care about getting that classification, just the process can prepare you to have a much more engaged institution. The new criteria, though, is going to include things like promotion and tenure, which may not be as applicable to this particular audience, but it will have, the words they're using is, you have to have a deep and pervasive culture of engagement across the institution, which includes a single office dedicated to the best practices of engagement. In order to get from wherever you are now to get ready to apply for this, you're going to need every bit of that next couple of years. We at Florida Campus Compact are holding institutes for engagement where you can send teams of leadership, and we will be doing, as I said, webinars. Dr. John Saltmarsh used to work at Campus Compact in the national office a number of years ago. He is now the administrator for Carnegie and has been with us here in Florida on a number of occasions, so we stand ready to help you. All of you, by the way, I took the liberty of looking at the registration list, and everybody here is a member of Campus Compact already, so I'm not trying to sell anything, but I just want you to know that we're here to help. And then finally, and I'll hand it over to Archie, some resources that you might find helpful. The Campus Compact President's Declaration is a lot about civics. How many of you know about the Crucible Moment Report? A few? Okay. It was done in 2012, I think, still really relevant around civics in particular. This is a call, College Learning and Democracy's Future, a call to action. Campus Compact created a praxis brief that will help this is a how to do it on your campus thing, and you can download all this from our website. Also, I think, again, this is also downloadable, the C2C thing, and then our website and our National Campus Compact website, and I'm sorry to talk so fast, but thanks for listening.
Thank you, Dee Dee. Archie's going to take a look at individual colleges, particularly Miami-Dade. If you would, please, Archie.
Great. Thank you so much, and thank you for having me and the opportunity to share some of the lessons I've learned working on the National Higher Education Accountability Agenda for the Obama and Bush administrations. If any of you had to do any of the gainful employment and college ratings, college scorecard activities, I apologize. I was partially responsible for those two things. But I have now been at Miami-Dade College for the last year and a half. I'm the Vice Provost for Institutional Effectiveness. And I find it very interesting, and I appreciate the fact that you have the data geek here as part of this panel, because at the end of the day, your institutional research and institutional effectiveness offices are the ones that will be producing the information that will be useful to state and federal policymakers in terms of the performance funding models and metrics that were mentioned. Very quickly, I want to talk a little bit about my institution a little bit. As you know, Miami-Dade College enrolls about 160,000 students annually. We're very proud to have received 2 designations this year. One is the Carnegie Community Engagement Classification, and the second one is the Ashoka U designation as a change maker campus. what we do at our institution, and that what we're very proud of, is we do have a culture of civic and community engagement and service learning that's really deeply embedded. And it really stems from these ideas being embedded in our curriculum and our co-curriculum. We have 10 student learning outcomes that all of our students are expected to achieve before they graduate, and at least three of those 10 learning outcomes have direct connections to civic engagement, ethical thinking, awareness about the environment. Our academic service learning is also fairly strong because we have faculty at the center of our service learning, where in fact our service learning started in our faculty and broadened out to include the co-curriculum. And so we have faculty members who embed the ideas of service learning in their classes in much the same way in looking at their curriculum, from everything from what's in the syllabus to the activities to reflection papers and assignments. The other thing that we did at the institution is we dedicated some resources on building an infrastructure around this. So in 2012, we did a reorganization that established the Institute for Civic Engagement and Democracy, or ICED, at the college. And this is where the commitment from leadership is very important, because they set up actual money, as opposed to just saying, here's an office or here's a title, but they set up money that went to staff and went to program dollars for this. And so it really increased the capacity of the institution to stand itself up, to stand the infrastructure up for it, not just to stand it up immediately, but also to build capacity for sustainability to go after external funding as well. And then they built very smartly a culture of assessment around this. And this is my area. And I've been very impressed with the amount of data collection that's been associated with our service learning at the college. We did build our own in-house database for our service learning activities. It does everything from post opportunities to tracking students' participation to producing something like a service transcript at the end of the experience. I know there are a lot of vendors out there that have similar products as well, but from my perspective, being the data guy, it's very helpful for me to use the information that ICED uses to track student participation so we can begin doing some of the very important work that will help in making the case that we need to make. And so ICED and the Earth Ethics Institute and MD Culture at MDC have partnered with my office on deeper analysis, not just descriptive statistics on counts, not just perceptions of student engagement, but really to go a little deeper and looking and tracking students to see what the impacts have been on them for their experiences. The big challenge, and I think the previous speakers have echoed this, is that it's sometimes very difficult to create a clear line of sight of what we are doing in the curriculum and co-curriculum with institution-level performance standards. And I want to go to a 30,000-foot view and say that it's not just the state agencies that are looking at this. I mentioned the college scorecard and college ratings earlier. The federal government is looking at this. Accrediting agencies are looking at this. And even professional practice have set some standards as well. The idea is that if we are doing our jobs well, and we are doing this in a thoughtful and intentional manner, that everything will add up so that by the time states and the federal government look at things like completion rates, the impacts of what we're doing at the curriculum, at the class level, will be seen. That's easier said than done, because we have to be a little bit more intentional about what we need to do. And so some things that we're doing at our institution is actually two things, from the bottom up and top down approaches. From the bottom up, we have institutionalized our priorities around this. We're very fortunate that we are in the process of launching our new strategic plan for the next 5 years, so we've been very intentional about building this idea of service learning, of civic engagement in our strategic plan. In fact, one of our objectives is around change making and around social and civic engagement and social innovation. What we're pushing for at our institution is evidence. And again, deeper evidence than just counts and self-reports. And once we get into some evidence and looking into more empirical analysis of student engagement and outcomes is looking at those practices that have an impact and then scaling them up. We are a huge institution, as you may know, and when we pilot things, our pilots tend to be larger because of the size of our institution. But our pilots still don't go to our entire student population. And so what we are doing at our end is looking at those pilots that are happening and looking to see what are those empirically supported best practices that we can scale up to the larger institution. This allows us to create buy-in from folks. As you know, the big B, the word buy-in, is sometimes very hard, and we are very blessed at the institution where we have faculty members who have bought into the idea that this is very important. But for those faculty members who are not, and for those administrators who may not be, having evidence in hand can help with that, with bringing that buy-in. Having partnerships, both internal and external, also helps with improving the operationalization of this so that we have efficiencies as well. And then from the top down, and this is, I think, goes to what Brian had mentioned, is the idea that we can advocate for more nuanced metrics. You can get me started on a soapbox about our post-secondary data infrastructure nationally and also at the state level. There are many, many areas to improve, such as things like looking beyond first-time, full-time students for completion rates, et cetera, et cetera. Beyond that, though, the idea of looking at what are the things that we could be measuring that should be considered at the state and the national level. From a national perspective, when I was at the U.S. Department of Education looking at what could be done for the college ratings and college scorecard activity, what was helpful was knowing what institutions could produce on their end, right? So when you're in DC or when you're in Tallahassee and you don't know what's in institutional research offices, it's very easy for you to say they should be able to do A, B, and C. But if they had known that we could produce things like, how about some valid and reliable data on engagement, some valid and reliable data on impacts to student outcomes of participation in these events, that changes the nature of the conversation. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with Washington Monthly, but Washington Monthly is a magazine that started going into the rankings, the college ranking games, a couple of years ago. And they're one of the very few rankings systems out there that includes service as a metric. That, to me, actually is a fantastic gateway, because once a national publication has opened the door to something like service being part of the conversation, that allows us to start advocating for things like service, et cetera, to be considered at the state and the national levels. The onus here, though, is at the institution level. Because, like I said, policymakers don't always know what institutions are capable of collecting and producing. And so it behooves us as institutions to produce the scholarship and to produce this information to actually demonstrate that we are able to do this. So I'm going to leave it at that, and then we can continue the conversation.
Okay, Archie, thank you very much. Susan's got a bit different perspective, if you would, please.
So I'm just going to suggest a piece of evidence that you might use to get some buy-in. In May, the Gallup-Purdue poll produced the results of the Big Six college experiences in their survey of students who had completed colleges. So everyone who took this survey was a completer, and there was something else that the people who had these Big Six experiences also identified. They had a very high degree of satisfaction with their undergraduate experience and satisfaction with their lives. And to me, of any student success outcome we could hope to achieve, satisfaction with life would seem to me to be the number one thing that we should aim for. So they divided these Big Six experiences into two groups. One was support during the time they were in college, and one was experiential. So I'll go through the three support statements that were the strongest, that all of the people who rated high said, I strongly agree with these support statements. I had at least one professor who made me excited about learning. My professors cared about me as a person. I had a mentor who encouraged me to pursue my goals and dreams. So in the end, that of course says it's faculty that makes the difference. We can have all kinds of grand schemes, but unless we have faculty buy-in and they are spreading their passion, none of this is going to work for any of us. So let me point you towards the experiential statements. I worked on a project that took a semester or more to complete. And there we're right with what Dee Dee was talking about in terms of immediately transferable job skills. Project management is something that everyone needs and virtually no one teaches anymore. It's just not one of those, it's not one of the pieces. Instead, what do? We break projects down for our students, don't we? We don't challenge them to figure out the project. So we've got to figure out a different way of helping them, and one way to do that is a semester-long or 2-semester project. I had an internship or job that allowed me to apply what I learned in the classroom. Because of all the things, I have a couple of friends who are working on their PhDs right now, and the issue they keep coming up against is transference. We teach it in one class, and students can't see how to make the transfer to the other place. And having a job or an internship that helps them do that, or a project, or a volunteer opportunity, those will help them with transference. And I would suggest to you that if we do service learning, if we do civic engagement the right way, the reflection piece will help us make the transfer along with our students, okay? And none of this works if we don't have reflection on the part of our students, right? That's the goal, is for them to think about, what did I learn? What does it mean to me? What did it mean to the people I shared the experience with? And the final thing, and here is where we really can reach out to our other colleagues on the student activities and the student life and leadership side of the house. I was extremely active in extracurricular activities and organizations while I attended college. That's the hardest thing for us at the community college. And if we could figure out a way to embed in classes some of those activities that would bridge the gap to those student organizations and also bridge the gap into our communities, then I would suggest to you that we have found the sweet spot for citizenship and for student engagement. So there it is. I'm the end of the line. My job was the Moore's motivated action sequence call and tell my speech teacher I did it.
Susan, thank you very much. My thanks to all of our panelists, for their comments. Well thought out and well delivered. We have about 10 minutes for a panel discussion. As you all were talking, something came to mind that I was having a conversation the other day with several of my colleagues at the university in anticipation of this particular session. And I said, well, we're going to talk about measurement. We're going to talk about civic engagement. And so, we got into this conversation, and they said, well, wait a minute. Your measurements sound awfully squishy. They sound incredibly subjective. How are you going to persuade a legislator? How are you going to convince a decision maker? Don't you need a test? Seriously, use the T word. Aren't your measures too soft? What can you do to strengthen those measures to convince somebody that there really is an outcome here that you're assessing? Anybody want to comment on that and help me out?
So I think two things. From a measurement perspective, obviously any improvements or refinements to any of our qualitative measures should be pursued. So at the very least, they should be very sound methodologically. But the other is, obviously, I think qualitative research still does not enjoy the same kind of rigor that people think that quantitative research does. And part of the education that we can provide to our leadership is the power of that qualitative data. My philosophy has always been, your numbers tell you one thing and your stories provide you the color for those numbers. You can look at a number and not know the students behind those numbers, but if you share the stories, it becomes that more powerful. So from our perspective, we do both. So we do, here are the numbers that prove, for those who like numbers and graphs, here's that, but also we provide some anecdotal and some qualitative evidence.
Yeah,
Brian?
John, to just follow up on Archie's point, I mean, I think from my perspective in working with state-level policymakers on these questions, I mean, there's sort of two tacks I've seen be successful and probably when done in tandem. One is, I mean, your question reflects the bias that's out there, but the quantitative data is pretty squishy too, right? So one way to approach this conversation is to say, look, I mean, I know you think this is your completion rate, but here are all the different types of students and institutions that aren't accurately reflected in that data. So one, let's talk off the perfect, and now let's get into a conversation about getting things better or improving them. So that's one thing. The other thing is, in the decision-making process, I actually think that anecdotal stories drive policy more than the data does. So if you can take your students to the legislature, if you can find ways that reflect actually all the tactics we talked about getting students engaged in the community, one way to do that is to have them engaged in the advocacy work that institutions and boards and systems do at the State House. Because sitting down with 3 students that say, you know, I'm a first-generation college student, I'm a returning veteran, I'm an adult student, here are the things I did on my campus, here's what they meant to me, and here's what I'm doing as a productive member of that community, that story resonates with the decision maker way better than a spreadsheet with a bunch of incomplete completion rates. So I think that part of it is we take those stories and ourselves off the table because we think that we don't have the numbers and we can't run a rigorous analysis and everybody wants things that you can count. But I actually think there's so much information that's presented to a policymaker that they can't weed through it and a story resonates better with them.
Well, I agree with that, but I also think that one of the things that we have done is that we have not really counted the things that matter. And I think we need to make an effort to put some rigor behind counting the touches with students. So that I mean, we all know that a student who is more engaged on the campus is gonna stick. But can I show you how many club meetings he went to? Can I show you how many outside speakers he attended? And if we count things, first of all, we convey to our students the idea that it matters if we make that count, if we publicize those counts. But second of all, we'll have some hard data to actually share among ourselves and figure out, well, which of those things really was successful and which was, well, not as important as we thought it was.
Dee Dee?
I agree. We need both and. And I skipped one of my slides, so I'm going to find it and give you this grand opportunity. If I can't, maybe I'm going the wrong way. Am I going the wrong way? Okay. Real quick, and while I'm trying to find my slide to give you an opportunity to collect some data for me, I wanted to commend a book to you. How many of you have heard the now very famous viral TED Talk by Brené Brown? Research professor at the University of Houston. Her new book called Rising Strong speaks about qualitative data, our ability to tell our story, and also I believe it has a huge piece in the reflection. She talks about how to have these difficult conversations in our culture, and I have already tried, I'm going to take a shot at creating one of these around her new book, but Rising Strong by, this is not going to go back. Oh well. The National Campus Compact Organization annually conducts a national survey. Therefore, we can compare Florida data to national data. I'm having a very difficult time getting all of our institutions to fully participate. Thank you for that, whoever just. And the part of the reason is because we aren't counting and people are afraid to answer the questions because they don't know. And I think, okay, somebody help me get to where I need to go. I think the part of the problem is we're not counting, but we have to get over that. We have to be able to be, believe me, when I got a request from the governor's office for a return on investment document for Florida Campus Compact this year, I almost had a heart attack. But we did it. We have numbers, we have data, but what I did when I did the report, we had lots of graphs, and we had, that's it, thank you.
There it is.
We had data, but I peppered it with stories. I peppered it with quotes from your faculty members, your students, about the value of the work that we were doing. If you could make sure, please, I'm begging, that your institution completes this survey. It's online right now. And if you'll send me your answers to the survey at the same time that you submit them online, I will reward you with something. It's one, I'm serious. I'm like, okay, I'm done with the stick. I need a bribe. This data can really go a long way. Another thing we're thinking about doing is actually doing like a yearbook to show to the legislature, and every institution will have a page, and you know you want to be in that book.
Archie, you had an issue you wanted to bring up about institutions beyond.
Before I get to that point,
Yes.
I think this conversation is broader than the civic engagement piece, because it talks about the data culture at our institutions. And we are at a stage now, both at the state level and nationally, where data are available to decision makers, data that we don't even know about are available to decision makers. And so the idea that we should hide behind our data, or that we should not be fully aware of those data, we don't have the luxury of doing that anymore. That, in fact, we should know what our data are, the good, bad, the ugly, so we can identify places to improve. So please partner with your institutional research folks, your institutional effectiveness folks. They might know more things about your institution than you do, and they can help you uncover some areas for improvement, but also highlight some positive areas.
So let me piggyback on that and say that out in the external world, we're all tenant farmers for Google. We are all generating all kinds of data that they're going to monetize, right? And if we do not intentionally create the data that supports our world, someone's going to figure out a way to monetize it from the outside, and we will have lost this opportunity. Now is the moment to think about what we want to count, how we want to count it, and really begin looking at it. Because pretty soon, I mean, every time we pick up a smartphone, someone's selling every finger touch, right? There will be a time when this opportunity is lost. Now's the time. Boy, don't I sound like a conspiracy theorist?
Yes, very much so. But thank you for
Sorry.
sharing. Archie, you're going to bring up a point?
Oh, so yeah, the other point that I touched on briefly in my presentation is, again, the broader scope of the idea that while the state's performance funding model is the one that's probably the most urgent because it has dollars attached to it, we have to look at the long game here, right? So it's not just, as Brian mentioned, performance funding models go up and down depending on who's in power. 10 years from now, we may be having a very different conversation. The data systems may be very different at that point as well. And so it behooves us to just keep track of these things, even though it's not our day job maybe, but if we keep track of these things, we're better able to find and address those potential challenges down the road.
Okay, thank you. Anything else anybody on the panel wants to bring up? Dee Dee?
Just real quick, to think about what you want to count. I love what you said, Susan. You might consider, our survey is a big step in the right direction. You might consider going on the Carnegie website and looking at their old application. They have a lot of frequently asked questions to look and see the kinds of things that they're going to be asking. The President's Honor Roll is another tool that you might use to think about the questions, the things that you should be measuring. I'd like to challenge you to also, although we've got to do this first, but the next step, I believe, is our community impact. Because our goal, of course, is when we send our students out into the community or with a faculty member or community partner, do no harm, right, is the first goal. In Brene Brown's book, she talks about how Engineers Without Borders had a big fail, and they did a publication on what went wrong. So I think we have to be honest about when it doesn't work and when it does. But if and when we can do community impacts, especially K-12 education, if you can show that your program increased those test scores by this amount or whatever it might be, those inputs and outcomes, outcomes and what's the other word? I forgot. Anyway, not my field, obviously.
Okay, thank you, Dee Dee. Okay, we're out of time for the panel, but we do have time for questions. So if you have some thoughts for our panel, please.
Hi there, my name is Sonia Walling, and I am a student of Public Policy and Administration here at SPC, and I'm graduating in December. And I have a question because this whole conference, part of the reason I'm here is it relates to my capstone project, which is civics education. But I was focusing on the middle school grades, only because they are now required statewide to be assessed, and of course assessments before promotion into high school. I am curious what your thoughts are. Do you believe now that the state is requiring assessment of that and making it such an emphasis, and many schools are also engaging, encouraging civic engagement, that we will see an improvement in the scores and the outcomes that we assess at the college level?
Dr. Dobson, would you like to? Dr. Dobson, would you like to? Oh. Well, tell me what.
We'll see an improvement in middle school. I don't know whether that translates. I don't know how that translates to the college level.
Well, I will tell you. What was the statistic that you had though for the middle school? Service
learning, based on survey data that we collected last year, increases the percentage of students who are report that they're highly engaged by a factor of 3.
So my experience in higher ed is that students who participate in service learning in the middle school and high school grades show up on their campuses expecting the same thing and ginned up about it and saying to their faculty members, hey, why can't we figure out how to apply this in the community? When Florida used to have an entity known as Learn and Serve that was a congressionally funded, CNCS funded program, and it was formula driven through the FEFP, and they would allocate funds to school districts specifically for K-12 service learning. Unfortunately, that program went away. And Dr. Dobson and I have talked many times about how to try to bring that back. But there's definitely a pipeline, if you will, as we begin to see more service learning happening in our schools.
Other thoughts on middle schools?
I was going to say I had the opportunity last week before last now, to visit a 6th grade classroom. They were working with original documents. They were looking at the Jamestown colony, and they were positing what had happened there. And their level of engagement and their insights were as good as any room of adults. And, your guess is as good as mine, right? But they were empowered to guess. And they owned American history in a way that I hadn't really seen people do that before. So it was pretty amazing thing.
Amazing. Yes, ma'am, in the back, please. We hold that question 1 second to get the microphone to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm a bilingual school psychologist and psychology professor at MiamiDade College, and I teach psychology for the purpose of social justice. And I know full well about assessment, and I'm aware of measures, and I'm aware of variables, and all of this business, but we forget that we need to push back all these government officials, because I teach human beings. I don't teach products that we can add applications to. So there's so much measuring that we can do. Also, I'm concerned about measuring long-term. Some of my students graduate and come back to me a year later. They send me an email. Professor Pedreska, remember that time that I sat in your office and we talked about service learning project? I have become maybe a member of PTA in my children's school. So I would like to see if we're considering long-term measures following students after graduation, because you can do short-term measures, but these are human beings that it takes time to process all of these, the impact of service learning or social entrepreneurship or all of these experiences that we provide for them. And to remind our government officials that human beings are not products. They are human beings. So we need to push back some of this nonsense. So, thank you.
Here. Any comments? Dee Dee?
Not this, I guess, is a shameless plug, but Florida Campus Compact's annual conference is next week in Boca, and one of the panels we're going to have is a combination of we're trying to come up with a research agenda for that purpose, is just try to figure out how do we know that we've improved civic engagement once they reach adulthood and get in. Are they really voting more? I mean, we have some preliminary data, but to find out here in our state, and how do we get that longitudinal data?
Other questions or comments? Yes, ma'am.
I'm at SPC. I'm sorry. I don't even know if I need this. But I have two questions. One is for Archie, and I would call you doctor, but I don't know how to pronounce your last name. So you're my new friend, Archie. Okay. You talked about scaling up and assessments to correspond with that. What does that look like?
So we're actually piloting right now at the college an internal evaluation process. So as you know, probably at your institutions, anything that's grant funded externally, you do an evaluation. So we thought, why don't we have a similar process for internal things that we're doing for any initiatives that we want to pilot? Because we want to learn about the things that we're doing. If your institution is anything like mine, we like doing stuff. We don't like sitting still. And some of you may be experiencing initiative fatigue, for example, right? The idea of so the idea of closing the loop is something that I think the field in general has to get better at anyway. And so we're trying to figure out a way to do an internal evaluation that's all improvement, no account. Really, it's just improvement as opposed to kind of a stick. So we can identify those best practices that do work and then scale those up.
So you're doing an internal asset map.
Essentially, yes.
Okay.
And so we're building capacity as well. Evaluators are there are professional evaluators out there, and this is what they do for a living. And so to the extent that you can partner with a couple or try to build it from the inside, again, your IRIE folks will be able to help with that.
Okay. And then I have one question for Brian on the end, and that was that you were talking about the direct and indirect. I'm sorry, now we're friends too, Brian.
That's great. That's what I was telling Archie.
So we'll get a glass of wine later.
That's right.
So you talked about direct and indirect
Yeah.
performance-based objectives, performance-based funding. So we know what the direct looks like, right? That would look like how much we've engaged our students and whatever measurements our institution did. But when you said a better avenue may be the indirect, what does that look like if we were to pursue that?
Yeah, so I think it's sort of a combination of the things that we've been discussing here about saying let's take a measure like year-over-year persistence as something that institutions need to report, right? And so as we're deciding what we want to count and how we're evaluating internally what the experiences of students were in things like belonging to a club or participating in a civic engagement activity that stretches more than some number of hours, or doing a semester or quarter-long internship. As we're counting those, how do we close the loop, to borrow Archie's phrase, to get back to tying that to part of the story we're telling about our persistence measure at the state level? And I think that it's how we roll these things up and not just look at the metrics that we were showing for the Florida college system and saying, well, we don't see anything that pertains to us, and find a way that we may disengage. I think it's about what are the student level impacts, the human level impacts that roll up to the things that are being asked of us to be measured. Well, I think institutions successfully do it. So I'll pitch it back to Archie, but I think that this is an institution level strategy for engaging state level policy is what I'm suggesting. So Archie has to use the civic engagement data at MiamiDade to tell his persistence story as part of that.
And I'm sorry, I just want
Yeah.
to continue this because it's very interesting. For the 5 states that you had on your slide that do actually allow for that flexibility, had any of the institutions successfully done that? Okay.
Yeah.
So how could just
No. I mean, none of the states have put in a direct,
but have they
percentage of
successfully
students
made
that
the
vote or
connection and the
whatever.
nexus between the indirect and the anecdotal?
Yeah, I think Archie would argue he does it. I think most institutions would suggest that part of the way they're telling the case about their persistence numbers or their completion numbers is pointing to the engagement activities students have. Susan mentioned it, we know when we have 6 contact points or whatever, students are more
Okay.
likely to stay. So,
Okay, thank you.
yeah.
Susan, did you want to weigh in here?
I was just going to say, I think that having that at the hour of lobbying is really the optimum moment. We don't want to have, if you're a third-year person working at the Department of Education, the amount of leeway you have, you're just applying the rubric. But in the creation of the rubric, in giving the flex, I think that really is key, that we have those stories fully fleshed out, and that we, completion is a terrible issue for us. It's a terrible issue for us. We have to figure out why it's an issue for people who are first time in college, in this group, why it's an issue for people who are returning. There are different issues for all of them. And that's the complexity of our institution, right? So we have to tell those stories.
So a prime example, I don't know if you've looked through the performance funding, the technical notes behind the performance funding, the way the state defines retention, for example, right? There's a gap there, right? So if you show up on the fall term, skip out on the spring term, and then come back on the fall term, you're counted as returned. As long as you have a fall to fall. So that idea and how that doesn't fit the narrative for most of our students, I think is something that needs to be brought up. And so to the extent that we have data, and both quantitative and qualitative, to show that most of our students, in fact, stop out a lot, and they may come back in the spring, but they're not getting counted. Those are the things that can help get more nuance in the metrics.
We have time for one final question. Anything else for the good of the order? Oh, Dee Dee, I'm sorry, go ahead, please.
When I mentioned to one of our college lobbyists that we were going to be having this conversation today, she said, "Oh God, do you really have to talk about that?" I mean, it's a very sensitive subject with your presidents, certainly, and the lobbyists that are in Tallahassee. But that's why I was trying to, or I don't know, I wasn't trying to. I think that's good that we framed this in a much bigger way about the national trends, the other funders who are expecting it, and it's not just the state of Florida. That said, they don't know yet what metrics might be added or taken away in the next session. The other thing it reminds me of, though, is if they were to go to one of these optional ones, it's sort of like their QEP, right? A lot of our institutions have used the SACS QEP as an opportunity to inject civic engagement work. So there may be opportunities to do this, but I still think that you can show that your engagement practices help to reach the metrics they've already determined, and then if we have the opportunity to add some more, maybe it'll be like the QEP, I don't know.
Okay, yes, please, sir. Thank you.
Is there a different set of metrics for the community college system versus the university system?
Yes. Yes.
Are the legislators aware of that?
Yes.
Yeah,
Are the lobbyists aware of that?
Oh yeah, the Board of Governors initiated their performance metrics with the state university system a few years ago. It's just now, this session is the first time that it was put into the proviso of the appropriations bill. The council, your council of presidents weighed in on what they thought were, and I'm pretty sure that whatever they eventually passed is kind of what the legislature went with.
Let me assure you, though, sir, that the universities are panicked. Certainly in South Florida, I mean, we have an officer specifically designed for student success. And you can imagine the pressure that he is under with, again, with all the metrics. Other comments or questions, ladies and gentlemen? Well, then please join me in thanking our panelists for an interesting and informative session.